Hey, in this lecture, I want to introduce you to the Aphonic Leveler. I've mentioned it a couple times, and this is a lecture that I want to just focus in on it and talk about specifically the Auphonic Leveler. The Auphonic Leveler is a piece of software separate from Audacity. It's not connected to Audacity in any way. It's a completely separate standalone piece of software. I came across the Auphonic Leveler and the Auphonic website really probably 4 years ago. I'm guessing around there. And I was looking for ways to become a better producer of audio. I wanted to find a way to make my audio levels a little more consistent because I was finding that when I would record a podcast and then edit a podcast, if I had multiple people in it speaking, sometimes the voice levels would be up on one and down on the other. And when I first started podcasting, I had the little mixer and I was exporting that mixer into a USB into, at that time, a Windows computer. And I was trying to chase those audio levels around a lot. And I thought, man, there's got to be an easier way to do this. And sure enough, I came across the Auphonic website. I'm probably going to say Audacity 20 times, but I mean Auphonic. It's kind of hard to switch back and forth. They both begin with AU, and so that confuses me. But hey, I ran across the Auphonic website and I started reading about what they do and the services that they offer. And I thought, man, this is some good stuff. Well, I found out that you can sign up on the Auphonic website for free, get an account there. And for free, you can upload up to 2 hours of audio per month for the Auphonic team to process for you, to show you what they do. So I did that a couple of times. I uploaded some audio, not really thinking a whole lot about it, but man, the stuff that I got back when I listened back to it, when they were done with it, man, it was amazing. They've got a processing system set in place that does just what it says it does. It levels the audio. Not only does it level the audio, but it keeps it from distorting, it keeps it from peaking, it does its own normalization, and really it does its own compression on some level. And so man, the result was so good that I started using it semi-regularly, but then I discovered that they have a desktop app as well for the Mac. And so I purchased that desktop app. I think it was around $80. It's like a one-time cost. And I downloaded that and I started using it. It has all of the same features that their website has when you upload a file. And so I've been using it ever since. I don't produce a podcast episode. I don't upload a podcast episode to any of my podcasts without running it through the Auphonic desktop leveler. It's that important to me. I've come to rely on it that much, and you're going to see why in just a moment. This screen that I have open shows the Auphonic desktop leveler. There's a few things I want to bring to your attention on this initial screen. First, down here on the bottom, near the bottom left corner, you'll see that we have a drop-down window here with different options in it. Right now it's set to a minus 19 LUFS because you'll remember that in our last lecture I mentioned that a minus 19 LUFS is the standard for mono podcasts, which is normally what I export. So it's left at minus 19 from the last time that I used it. But if we select that drop-down window, you'll see that there's other options in there. I can go all the way up to a minus 13 LUFS, which in parentheses says very loud, all the way down to a minus 31 LUFS, which is very quiet. Now remember, the number before the LUFS acronym is a 1-for-1 reference to decibel level. In other words, a minus 19 LUFS is equivalent to minus 19 dB. The difference is we're looking at average audio over a period of time. When we're talking about LUFS and LUFS level, we're not as interested in momentary peak levels as we are in the overall level of your podcast from beginning to end. So let's say you have a 30-minute podcast and you've recorded that, you've exported the file, either an MP3 or an M4A, and you're ready to upload it to your service. You want that file to be at a minus 19 LUFS if it's a mono file, and if it's a stereo file, you want it to be at a minus 16 LUFS prior to uploading it. Now you'll notice here that in this selection window, it says minus 16 LUFS, and then in parentheses it has podcasts and mobile. That's kind of misleading. It's true, but not always. Again, if you're recording in mono or you're exporting in mono, you want it to be a minus 19 LUFS, not a minus 16 LUFS. But if all you do is stereo, you can leave it right here at a minus 16 LUFS. If I open up that window again, We'll see that that top level says minus 13 LUFS. That's actually the value that YouTube uses. So if you're uploading your podcast to YouTube as well, they're changing that level when they process the video. They're changing that level to a minus 13 LUFS. Spotify is going to change it to a minus 15 LUFS because that's their standard. That's their LUFS standard for audio. But the industry standard for podcasts is either a minus 16 LUFS for stereo or a minus 19 LUFS for mono files. And there's other choices on there that we're not going to talk about. There's some video settings that we're not going to do because we don't do video here. We're just doing audio. So I'm going to put this back to a minus 19 LUFS and leave it there. The next thing you'll notice is the checkboxes right below that window. That first one's called the Adaptive Leveler. And you'll see a little tool window popped up there because that's where my mouse is sitting. And it says analyzes your audio and corrects level differences between speakers, music, and speech, and applies dynamic range compression. I always leave that checked because what that's telling me is if I have spots in my podcast that are low in volume, and then spots that are high in volume, and then spots that are low in volume again, and then high in volume again, by leaving the Adaptive Leveler checked, Auphonic is going to correct those differences. It's going to bring those low spots up, and it's going to knock those high spots down to give you a minus 19 LUFS from beginning to end. Remember, this is overall sound level that we're talking about. And so it's going to smooth out those spots for you. I'm going to show you an example of that here in just a second. In the last lecture, we looked at that plugin, that Waves plugin, and we saw how setting that to a minus 19 LUFS did the same thing as we set it manually and as we ran that plugin in order to get to a minus 19 LUFS. If you haven't viewed that last video yet, you should maybe stop this one and go view that one first. It's got some information in there that will help you understand what Auphonic's doing here in their desktop leveler app. So I always leave that checked because it smooths out the different, if I have two different speakers, two different people talking, one of them's soft-spoken and the other one's kind of boisterous, other than me chasing that down all the way through my waveform and through the track and trying to boost it up here and lower the level there and boost it up again here, Auphonic does it for me, so I leave that checked. And same with the person listening to your podcast. You don't want the listener to your podcast to have to stay on the volume dial, and always, okay, I didn't hear what they said. It went real low all of a sudden, so I have to turn it up here and I have to turn it down there, and your listener ends up kind of chasing the volume all around too. By checking that Adaptive Leveler, it eliminates all that, plus it puts a little bit of compression on it, which is good. And right below that, we have noise and hum reduction. The tool, the pop-up tool hint says classifies regions with different backgrounds and automatically removes noise and hum. And that's exactly what it does. Let's say you're doing a multi-track recording and you've got someone at a distance, either over Skype or Zoom or some other program like that, and you're recording their audio at the same time and you're putting it on a different track. I do this a lot, and my audio is on a separate track. Well, maybe the background noises coming from them are a little bit different than the background noises in mine. Maybe there's a little bit of hum that's been picked up along the way somewhere that's embedded in their audio. Or maybe they're recording their audio at their location and then sending you a link so that you can go get it. Either way, you might have a little bit different background sound, a little bit different hum level in it than yours does. By keeping that checked, it's telling Auphonic to double check that, to keep an eye on the noise and the hum reduction, and if there's a problem with noise or hum, eliminate it. You really can't go wrong there, so I always leave that checked. That third checkbox is the high-pass filter, and it says removes disturbing low frequencies depending on the context, music, speech, or noise. I used to have that checked all the time, but I found that by checking that, it would seem to get kind of essy to me. It's a high-pass filter. And so what it's going to do is knock down lower frequencies. But I do that in Audacity before I ever hand it over to Auphonic. Remember when we talked about the 100 hertz rumble and how that I always employ the 100 hertz rumble filter on my audio before I export it? It's basically doing the same thing. But if you check this here, it's going to remove some bass tones. I used to do it again, but it seemed to emphasize the higher tones a little bit too much for my taste, and so I don't use that anymore. I do that in Audacity before I ever hand it over to Auphonic. Next, we can look at the top of the screen. And at the top, we have preferences, which we want to look at next. We also have presets. I only have one preset in here, and it's a preset for a -19 LUFS for a mono podcast. And we're going to see those settings in just a minute because they're the same settings that I have set up for default because, again, I always export rather in mono. So if we look at the Preferences tab, there's some good information in here for us. There are 6 tabs across the top of the preferences, and so let's talk about these a little bit. The noise reduction amount, I always leave in auto. In fact, I've never touched any of these settings. I've played with them a little bit here and there, and I always put them back to auto because Auphonic knows what it's doing, and it knows how to grab this stuff, better than I do. So as far as noise reduction amount, I tell it, yeah, keep it in auto. I know it's going to remove unwanted noise. I've seen it do it. I've heard it do it, and I understand, that it's doing it, and I don't have any problem with that. If I want to change the noise reduction amount, I have different options here. I can knock it all the way down to complete silence up to 3 dB. So again, I just leave it at auto. It does its thing, and it does it nicely. The maximum peak level, this again gets to where do you want to set your peak level limit while Audacity is giving you your LUFS setting. Remember in the last lecture, we did this thing manually as well. We had it set at a -2 dB, not to exceed a -2 dB. And we talked about, if you go too much over that, you risk exceeding 0 on your peak audio moments, and that could result in some clipping and some ugly audio throughout your podcast. I leave it on auto. I suppose I could set it to a -2 dB, but again, I like to just let Audacity, see, there I did it again. I like to just let Auphonic, do its own thing because, again, it does it so well. And like I said, I've used this for about 4 years now, and I've never had any problem with it at all. And so I leave that at auto, and I just let it do its thing. The next level down here says select sample or true peak measurement for final limiter. And I always use true peak. True peak is what it really is in the moment. It's looking ahead. It's going to find those peak moments, and it's going to give me a maximum peak level and my LUFS standard according to what the actual true peak is that it sees in your file. The LUFS gate, again, I leave it at auto. I've never had to touch it, and I'm sure I never will. The fade in, fade out time, I don't use this. I suppose if you wanted to fade in some music at the beginning, fade out some music at the beginning, or somewhere in between if you have a commercial or whatever. But again, I do all of that in Audacity before I ever give it to Auphonic, and so I leave it at no fades. The next tab over that we need to look at is the output format. And it's here that we need to say a couple of things. Up until now, we've exported all of our files that we've exported out of Audacity as either MP4 or MP3. But you don't have to do that. You can export your files out of Audacity as a WAV file as well. And I'm telling you that now because you might want to leave your exported file in a WAV format as long as possible. Remember, WAV is an uncompressed file. It's an audio file that's as near the original recording, the sound of the original recording, as you can get. There's no loss in it. There's no compression in it. Consequently, it's a huge file normally. But now that I'm telling you about the Aphonic Leveler, and even from the last lecture with the Waves plugin, you might want to consider exporting in WAV initially before you run it through Auphonic if you do end up purchasing Auphonic, leaving it as a WAV file originally in order to retain more of that original quality of the audio, because when you do convert it to MP3 or M4A, you're going to introduce some lossiness because those are compressed files. So it's up to you. I just throw that out to you for now. I leave this set for now to MP3 because when I'm done with Auphonic, I want my MP3 to be ready to upload to my server for my podcast. But if I look at those options in that output format window, you can see I have them all. I have a WAV option. I have a WAV float option. We have the other audio formats that we mentioned previously in other lectures. And we have the AAC, or the M4A, it's also called, that we can export it as. I'm going to leave it at MP3 for now, and I always leave the sample rate to the original. If I need to change it, I can do it here. The default is 44,100. We've talked about that previously in the intermediate course. and 48,000, which would be what we would have to use if we were putting this into a movie like a DVD. But we're just going to leave it original. I don't mess with it. It's always there. The bit depth, since we're exporting as an MP3, there is no bit depth. If I change my format, my output format to a WAV, then it activates my bit depth here, and I can select 16-bit if I'm exporting, again, as a WAV file, and I'm going to put it on a music CD. It has to be 16-bit in order for CD players to recognize it. Or I can go 24-bit or 32-bit. But when I am in MP3, again, that's irrelevant. There is no bit depth. And once again, I always mix down to mono. I don't mix down to stereo. I found no advantage to it at all. The mono mix down is really kind of a joint stereo where you're getting the same audio out of both the left and right speakers. And if you're exporting a file that's big, if you've got like a 2-hour podcast, you're going to notice a size difference between mono and stereo. I always leave mine at mono. The bit rate for lossy compression, I've got this set at 96. I can change this in here. I can type whatever I want in it. If I've exported an MP3 file that is, say, 192 kilobit sample right out of Audacity, and that's what I've got, I can reduce the bit rate here, the sampling rate here a little bit. Again, if you've got a long episode that you're exporting, a big 2-hour episode or 2.5-hour episode or whatever, that file's going to be big. You can reduce the bit rate here in order to make that file size smaller. The person out walking through the park, listening to your podcast on their earbuds might be really thankful if you can reduce that file from 100 megabytes or 200 megabytes down to 15 or 20 megabytes. It's going to stream a lot easier. So they'll probably be more grateful. I found that I can take this rate here, this bit rate, I can take all the way down to a 64 kilobit per second rate without really degrading the audio. Now, if I have a lot of music in the podcast, and especially if it's something complex with a lot of different instruments or some type of EDM, sometimes when I get down to 64 kilobits per second, I can notice some quirky little sounds in there every once in a while. It just sounds kind of weird. But other than that, if you've just got mainly speech going on, audio dialogue going on between two or more people in your podcast, going down to 64 kilobits per second can be a good idea because it saves file size without really any degradation that I found in the audio. I've got this set at 96. I'm going to leave it at that for now for the purposes of this lecture. If we look at that next tab on top there, the output file, let's talk first of all about the third window down where it says if output file exists. I have options in there. I can create a unique file name, and that puts it in the same folder. I can overwrite the existing file, again in the same folder, or just not export it. Just tell Audacity, oh, stop, wait, don't do it. Let's go to plan B. And right above that, which is related to it, we have the output folder. Normally, Auphonic's going to put it right into that same folder that it came out of. But you can select a different folder here by simply clicking Choose Folder. But what I've done was in this top window here, I put a suffix on the output file. In other words, I append this verbiage onto the output file that I'm doing. It does drop it into the same folder, but it gives it the original name plus whatever I type in this box here. And in this one, I've got post Auphonic 96K 19 LUFS, just to give me a visual trigger that, hey, this is what I did with this file. I exported it, I ran it through Auphonic, it's post Auphonic, Auphonic's done its thing. It's at a minus 19 LUFS, and I sample it at a 96K. So I know immediately by looking at the file name what I've done with the file. So that's what I do, and you can get creative in there and put whatever you want to put in there. This next tab is the Intro-Outro tab. This is where you can pick up your audio file for your intro, your audio file for your outro, and you can tell Audacity, this is where it's located on my computer. Go get it and bring it in here and, make it the intro file, make it the outro file to the podcast that I'm going to be telling Audacity to sample. I don't do that because, again, I do that in Audacity. My intro and outro, my complete podcast is done in Audacity before I ever give it to Auphonic, and so I don't do that. The warnings are good. If my level gain exceeds 50 dB, yeah, I'd kind of like to know about that. That's, pretty loud. If my signal to noise ratio is smaller than 5, notify me. Sure, I'll take that. These are just warnings that are kind of common sense warnings that, yeah, I want to know if there's a real problem with something that I've exported and something that Auphonic is processing. Tell me about it. I've never had any of these go off. I kind of lead a simple podcast. All my podcasts are pretty easy, and I don't have anything complicated in them, and so I don't really get any warnings like this. The next tab over is simply hardware, the number of CPUs to use, the audio processing block size. If you start getting error messages and your processing slows down, you might change this to a lower number. I keep mine at 4. I've never touched it. You can also choose a temporary processing directory if you want to. These are where temporary files will be created while Audacity is processing. But again, I just do one file at a time. It doesn't take very long. But if you're doing multiple files, if you're going to dump 20 files in this thing, you might want to create a temporary processing directory that Audacity can use while it does its processing. So let's close this window. Okay, what I've done is I've opened up a file and put it in the Auphonic desktop leveler. Just to save us a little bit of time if you happen to watch me do that, I've just already put it in here and it's ready to go. This happens to be a WAV file that I've exported out of Audacity. Again, if you're going to be using Auphonic, you might want to keep your exported file in the WAV format as long as possible in order to get the best sample possible. But in this window on the left, you'll see that I've got Lecture 25, Auphonic example.wav loaded up. And again, you can put multiple files in here. You can fill this thing up with files and have them do all of it. If you're doing multi-track editing and you've got, say, 4 separate tracks that you've brought into Audacity and you want to export those individually as waves, you can put them all in here. You can get them all done at the same time. You can do this however you want to do it. You can experiment with it, play around with it, and see what works best for you. But over on the right side, we have some information about this audio. First of all, it's telling me where the input file exists up there in the gray area. But then down in the white and blue area where I've got rows, you can see information about that file that I've placed in there. It's sampled at a 44.1. It's only one channel. It's sampled at 24-bit. It tells me how long it is and the physical size. When I hit the process all files, it's going to process every file that I've got sitting in that left-hand pane according to the preferences that I've set that we've already gone through. And so when I press process all files, it's going to begin that processing action, and when it's done, it will give me right below here in the road area additional information about the file that I put in as well as the file that I put out. And so you'll see that there's 2 columns there, an input and an output. As soon as it processes the file, it's going to have information loaded on both sides of those. It'll be a before and after comparison. And so let's click on Process All Files. And now that the processing is complete, you can see that I've got more information. First of all, up in that gray area, it tells me not only the input file name, but it tells me the output file, where it's located and its name. And then if I come down into this charted area again, looks a little bit like a spreadsheet, you can see that my 2 columns, input and output, have different values in them now. The loudness of that file when I started was a minus 28.84 LUFS. The output file is just what I asked for. It's now a minus 19 LUFS. And so it elevated the volume by that many dB in order to get the overall output consistent at a minus 19 LUFS for a mono podcast. The peak level that it saw was a minus 1 dB. And then you'll see the maximum momentary and maximum short term. Those are just the peaks as it was processing. As I went through the processing, it saw different peaks. You can see that the gain mean and gain min and max, mean doesn't mean it's having a bad day, it just means the average gain that it did during the processing. Signal to noise ratio, again, this is just information you may or may not want to use or even want to see, but it tells you what it's doing. That original WAV file that I put in was 31.6 megabytes in size. The output file in MP3 was 2.9 megabytes. The noise reduction, it took it down to 100 dB, complete silence. It checked noise the entire length of that file that I had in there. It was a short file. It's only 4 minutes and 10 seconds. And then finally, hum reduction wasn't necessary, again, because I eliminated the hum when I was in Audacity. And so Auphonic didn't have to do that. Now let me show you one more thing. I've got the before and after files already open in Audacity, and I want to show you the difference physically of what those look like. This is the same file. It's the same mono file. It's not a stereo file. It's the same mono file. And you can see in the label in the top file over on the left side, it says pre-Auphonic. That's the file that I had loaded into Auphonic that we did the processing on. After we processed and exported it, it came up as the post-Auphonic 96K, which happens also to be at a -19 LUFS. And so this is a before and after picture of that same section of audio that we just processed. So you can see the difference. You can see that the Aphonic desktop leveler took it to a -19 LUFS overall, and there's no peaking of the audio, there is no distortion, there's no getting up too close to 0 dB, and that's going to be good audio. And that's what the Aphonic Leveler does for us. It gives us good, consistent audio. And so if that's something that's within your budget, you ought to think about getting it. I don't upload a podcast episode anymore without running it through the Auphonic desktop leveler. It's that important to me, and it gives me consistent audio. It gives my listeners a pleasant experience while they're listening to my podcast because they're not having to chase the volume up and down because there's really no change in the level. It's consistent all the way through at a -19 LUFS. So that's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about hosting your podcast. So I'll see you there.